Imagine waking up in a stone cottage. It's minus 15 degrees Celsius. There's no insulation, no heating, and no food except moldy grain. Outside, wolves prowl the forest. Inside, your family huddles together to survive. The year in medieval Europe was not measured by calendars or clocks, but by the seasons. For the vast majority of people, peasants tied to the land, time was marked by the rhythm of the soil, the sun, and the harvest. Before the arrival of winter, life pulsed with relentless labor and a singular anxiety. Would they have enough to survive the long, punishing months ahead? In the early spring, life stirred again after months of hunger and cold. Fields, which had frozen solid and lain dormant under a pale gray sky, slowly thawed. With the first breath of warmth, peasants took to the land. The men hoed and plowed using crude wooden tools reinforced with iron, while oxen struggled to pull the heavy plows through muddy earth. Women and children scattered seeds, barley, wheat, rye, and oats, with practiced hands. These seeds were not just grain, they were hope. If the weather held, if pests were few, and if no war or fire swept through, these seeds would become bread, beer, and gruel, the foundations of survival. By midsummer, the fields were green and alive. Peasants labored from dawn until dusk beneath a blazing sun. There was no leisure. Even on Sundays, which were technically days of rest, minor tasks crept in: mending tools, tending livestock, patching roofs. The summer was both a blessing and a burden. Crops needed attention, animals needed care, and the wilds were filled with danger. Wolves, thieves, and tax collectors all prowled the edges of village life. Still, the sun brought life. Fruit ripened, chickens laid more eggs, rivers were full and fast. Every day of labor in the summer was an investment against the winter to come. Then came autumn, the season of reckoning. As the leaves turned gold and brown, so did the grain. The harvest was the most crucial moment in the peasant year. Entire families worked side by side, sickles in hand, bending and cutting, stacking and hauling. The harvested grain was threshed and stored in barns or granaries, if the village was lucky enough to have them. Root vegetables were pulled from the earth. Apples, pears, and plums were gathered and preserved. Firewood was chopped and stacked. Salted meats were prepared from livestock that couldn't be kept alive through.
For a medieval peasant, the memory of past winters, of famine, of sickness, of friends and family lost to the cold, was always close at hand. Hunger did not announce itself all at once. It crept in slowly. A shorter portion here, a skipped meal there. The mind began to race in October. Was that mouse rustling in the granary a sign of a coming infestation? Did that root cellar seem too damp? Were there too many mouths this year? This fear was rooted in bitter experience. In years of poor harvests, desperation set in early. Families would dig into winter stores in November, knowing they were robbing themselves of meals in February. Some turned to acorns or nettle soup. Some sought alms from monasteries. Others simply tightened their belts and prayed. And prayers were many, for faith was both a comfort and a last resort. As October turned to November, the landscape changed. The once busy fields grew quiet. Tools were stored. The buzz of bees and the hum of insects faded. Trees shed their leaves, carpeting the earth in gold and rust. The air grew still, heavy with the scent of damp soil and smoke. Then, one morning, the first snowfall came. Not the deep snow of January, but a soft warning, white dusting the rooftops, clinging to bare branches. It was beautiful and ominous. This moment marked a psychological shift. The world outside became still and silent. Fields that had once fed the village now stood barren and lifeless. Paths grew slippery. The forest grew darker. Livestock were penned in, their lowing and bleating a constant reminder of the limited food stores that had to be stretched over months. Even the daylight faded. By mid-December, darkness fell by late afternoon, and mornings came slowly, bathed in a thin blue light that offered little warmth. For the peasant family, daily life changed. No more long days in the field. Now it was about survival, indoors. A single fire, often in the middle of a one-room hut, provided heat and cooking. Smoke hung low in the room, eyes watered constantly, and coughs were common. Clothes were never dry. There was no privacy. Families huddled together on straw-stuffed mattresses, sharing body heat. Outside, the wind howled through thatch and cracks. Inside, hunger whispered from the corners. The memory of harvest days lingered. People remembered the golden wheat swaying in the breeze, the sun warming their backs, the laughter of neighbors. But now, laughter was rare. Anxiety dominated every thought. Was the bread supply holding out? Could they afford to kill another chicken? Would the neighbor's child survive the fever he'd caught last week? Winter, for medieval peasants, was not simple.
It was the only chance they had to build a fortress of food, fuel, and strength before the siege of cold began. And that siege was long, merciless, and always uncertain. Thus, the peasant's year was not a cycle of hope, but of endurance. Spring gave birth to toil, summer to struggle, autumn to fear, and then winter came, not as a gentle rest, but as a test of everything they had done, every choice they had made, every piece of bread they had stored. In the medieval world, the months before winter were filled not with celebration, but calculation. Every harvested grain, every stacked log, every preserved apple was a shield against what they knew too well. Winter would show no mercy. And when that first snowfall blanketed the world in silence, they could only wait and hope. When the first snow settled and the land turned white and still, the true character of winter in medieval Europe began to emerge. What had started as a quiet hush over the earth quickly transformed into an unrelenting assault on body, mind, and soul. In northern Europe especially, the winter came hard and fast. Temperatures dropped with little warning. One morning a field might glisten with frost, and by nightfall it would vanish beneath a thick, impenetrable blanket of snow. For peasants who had barely survived the long seasons of labor, this was not a time of rest. Winter was the real enemy, the truest test of resilience in a world with no mercy for the weak. The suffering was worsened by a broader climatic shift, the period historians now call the Little Ice Age. From the 14th to the 19th century, the Northern Hemisphere experienced a prolonged drop in temperature. Winters grew longer, colder, and more unpredictable. Crops failed more frequently. Growing seasons shortened. The margin between survival and starvation, already thin, disappeared almost entirely. By December, much of northern Europe was locked in ice. Snow buried roads and blocked the narrow trade routes that connected isolated villages to market towns. With movement halted, essential goods, salt, iron, tools, cloth, ceased to arrive. If a village had not stocked up by autumn, it was too late. Isolation set in, and with it, fear. There would be no help until spring. For some, spring would come too late. Even rivers, which had once served as vital arteries of trade and travel, froze solid. The Thames in London became a frozen highway, hosting makeshift markets and festivals on its icy surface in later centuries. But for the medieval villager, a frozen river was no celebration. It was a lifeline, cut off. Fishing was impossible. Barges couldn't reach the village. Communication with the outside world was severed. In such isolation, small misfortunes grew. If they remained open at all, they were often overcrowded, dangerous, and diseased. Many shut down entirely, their supplies exhausted. With no heating beyond the hearth and no insulation in walls or floors, staying indoors became only slightly better than staying outside. Stone walls turned icy to the touch. Water froze in wooden buckets. Breath came out in plumes, even beside the fire. Inside the peasant home, life was grim. The hearth, the only source of heat, was usually just a small fire in the center of the room, venting smoke through a hole in the roof. The fire was fed with whatever fuel remained: dried dung, sticks, peat, or if lucky, wood from the autumn haul. But wood burned fast, and many families were forced to ration it carefully. The fire could not be left burning all night. In the mornings, waking meant facing an interior that felt nearly as cold as the outdoors. The wind crept in through cracks in walls and under doors. Roofs, often made of thatch or thin wooden shingles, leaked when snow melted or sleet fell. Blankets were thin and shared by entire families. Beds were often infested with lice or fleas. The scratch of discomfort was constant. There was no escape from the cold. It seeped into bones. Children cried from aching limbs. Elders grew silent and still. Hands cracked and bled from exposure, and still chores had to be done. Animals needed feeding. Ice had to be broken to fetch water. Snow had to be cleared from pathways to prevent roofs from caving in. All of this was done with numb fingers, wrapped in scraps of wool and old cloaks. The dark was just as punishing as the cold. Winter days were short, and what little daylight there was came in a dim gray hue. By late afternoon, it was night again. In some parts of Europe, only 8 hours of weak light broke the constant blackness. Candles were precious and rationed. Most homes had only the light of the fire. Families sat in gloom, huddled and silent. It was during this time that the mind began to suffer. Depression was not a recognized illness, but its effects were felt. People grew withdrawn, tempers flared, old resentments surfaced. The lack of light became a weight pressing down on every thought and interaction. Disease thrived in these cramped and unsanitary conditions. Respiratory infections were common. Pneumonia, influenza, and tuberculosis swept through homes. There was no real medicine, only herbal remedies and prayers. With bodies weakened from lack of food and constant exposure to cold, recovery was rare. A simple cough could become a death sentence. Entire families would fall ill. In many cases, neighbors would find a door unopened for days and enter to find only silence and bodies. Superstition grew in the dark. Medieval people did not separate the physical from the spiritual the way modern minds do. A long, brutal winter was not just a weather event, it was seen as a punishment, a test, or a curse. Witches were blamed for failed harvests. Evil spirits were thought to travel freely in the long nights. Church bells rang louder more often. Holy water was sprinkled on doorways. Crosses were carved into wooden beams. Fear of the unknown filled the vacuum left by silence and sickness. Those who could still walk ventured to churches and chapels, not just for warmth, but for hope. Clergy warned of sin, of judgment, of the end of days. Fasting, penance, and prayer were constant. The message was clear. Suffering was part of God's plan. Those who endured it with patience would be rewarded in the next life. But for the hungry child or the grieving mother, the promise of future salvation offered little comfort. Meals were smaller and less frequent. The grain stored in the autumn dwindled quickly. Gruel became thinner. Bread grew harder. Some families boiled bones to extract the last trace of fat. Others ground acorns or chestnuts into flour, desperate to stretch their supplies. Malnutrition weakened everyone. Children stopped growing. Elderly people wasted away. In times of extreme scarcity, rumors of darker solutions spread, of dogs disappearing, of travelers never arriving, of famine driving people to unthinkable acts. This was the essence of the medieval winter. It was not just about temperature. It was about being trapped. Trapped by the cold, by the dark, by fear, by hunger. Trapped in a cycle that seemed eternal. The hope of spring was far away, and there was no certainty it would bring relief. One bad year often led to another. One lost harvest meant years of debt or dependence. For peasants, survival was not guaranteed. It had to be earned through suffering, through strategy, through luck. And so each day of winter passed slowly, without joy, without warmth, and often without conversation. People grew thin, quiet, and watchful. Every cough was noticed. Every meal was counted. Every footstep outside was cause for suspicion or dread. There was no escape, only endurance. And as the wind howled over the frozen land and the snow piled high against doors and walls, peasants knew that the world outside had turned against them. The same land they had sowed, the same sky that had given rain and sun, now delivered only ice and silence. Winter was not just a season. It was a siege. And inside each hut, each chapel, each barn, people waited in the dark, wondering who would survive to see the thaw. By the time February arrived, winter had reached its cruelest stage. In medieval Europe, this month was feared above all others. It was not merely a marker on the calendar, but a dark, inevitable passage through the worst of the year. Known by many as the month of death, February carried the bitter consequences of all that had come before: failed harvests, freezing temperatures, dwindling firewood, and the slow, steady starvation of entire communities. In the heart of winter, even the strongest began to falter. The grain stores, measured carefully at the start of the season, had either run out or gone bad. Moisture seeped into poorly sealed granaries. Rats gnawed holes into sacks, spreading filth and disease. What little grain remained was often stale, moldy, or spoiled. And yet, it had to be consumed. There was no choice. Hunger overruled caution. Rye, a common staple among the peasants due to its hardiness, posed a silent danger when improperly stored. In damp, dark conditions, it could develop a toxic fungus called ergot. This fungus contaminated the grain invisibly. When baked into bread and eaten, it introduced a strange madness. Those affected by ergotism experienced vivid hallucinations, burning sensations in the limbs, and in severe cases, the rotting away of fingers, toes, and even entire limbs. Known in later centuries as St. Anthony's fire, this slow and agonizing affliction appeared suddenly and unpredictably. Villagers had no understanding of the cause. To them it was a curse, a punishment, a dark mystery that fed the already fertile ground of superstition. Bread, when it could still be made, was often stretched with whatever fillers could be found.
Sawdust, ground acorns, dried weeds, and even powdered bones were mixed with flour to increase bulk. The result was barely edible, but it filled the stomach for a short time. Families would ration crusts among children and elderly members. Mothers went hungry so their infants could nurse. Fathers worked with empty bellies. By midwinter, it wasn't uncommon for entire households to eat only one small meal a day, if that. Meat, a rare luxury in summer, became nearly mythical in winter. Only the wealthy had the means to preserve meat in quantity, using salt harvested or purchased during the autumn months. For the poor, fresh meat was almost impossible to come by. Slaughtering livestock was a last resort. Animals were more valuable alive, producing milk or pulling plows. If a cow died, every part was used: flesh, organs, bones, hooves. Nothing was wasted, but the meat spoiled quickly, even in the cold. Without proper storage, it became a breeding ground for bacteria. More than one family fell ill from desperate feasts on spoiled meat. Salt itself was a precious commodity. It was imported in many regions, heavily taxed and difficult to obtain. In winter, the price of salt soared, putting it far out of reach for most peasants. The lack of salt meant more than just bland food. It meant food could not be preserved safely. What was meant to last weeks or months often turned bad within days. Indoors, the close quarters created a new set of problems. With every member of a household gathered into one small, smoky room, hygiene deteriorated. Water was too precious to waste on washing. Clothes were rarely changed. Straw bedding became matted with filth. Rats and fleas flourished in the dark, warm crevices of huts and barns. They found shelter in thatched roofs, under floorboards, and among the hay used as insulation. And with them came disease. The plague, always a lurking threat in the medieval world, found easy prey in winter. Though the Black Death is most associated with the mid-14th century, outbreaks of plague and other pestilences continued for centuries. In the tight, filthy living spaces of peasants, even a single flea bite could start a chain of suffering. One cough could infect an entire family. And with nowhere to run, disease burned through villages, unchecked. There were no hospitals. Healers were few, and their remedies crude. Boiled herbs, whispered prayers, and rudimentary bloodletting were the extent of most treatments. Superstition filled the void left by science. Some believed illness came from bad air. Others blamed witches, demons, or sin. In desperation, villagers turned to relics, charms, and pilgrimages. But few could travel in the frozen world, and fewer still had the strength to walk. As bodies weakened from hunger and infection, death became a daily presence. Elders, already frail, were usually the first to succumb. Children followed. Mothers died in childbirth, too weak to endure the strain. Fathers collapsed from overwork and starvation. Death came quietly, often in sleep, sometimes in agony. Its presence no longer startled, only numbed. It was just another part of winter. When someone died, the mourning was brief. There was no time for elaborate rituals. The living had too much to do to survive. Yet even burial presented its own challenge. The ground in February was hard as stone. Frozen solid, it resisted shovels and picks. In some cases, bodies were stored in barns or cellars, wrapped in cloth and left until the thaw. In others, shallow graves were hacked into the ice-covered earth with axes and iron bars. Frozen soil gave no comfort. The dead could not be properly laid to rest, and this, too, weighed on the minds of survivors.
fear of restless spirits, improper burials, and divine displeasure haunted many. Funerals were held in the snow, small gatherings of shivering mourners offering whispered prayers. The wind carried away their voices. There was little ceremony, no music, no warmth, just a body, a hole in the earth, and a silence that followed for days. The emotional toll of this season was immense. Hunger gnawed not just at the stomach, but at the soul. It stripped away dignity. It turned neighbors into rivals, and sometimes enemies. The line between survival and morality blurred. There were tales, always whispered, never confirmed, of theft, betrayal, even cannibalism in the worst-hit villages. Whether true or not, the mere existence of such rumors spoke volumes. Trust eroded. Communities that once celebrated together in the fields grew cold and suspicious. Doors were barred. Food was hidden. The generous spirit of harvest time vanished. People kept their heads down, eyes averted. Every stranger was a potential threat. Every cough, a warning. In monasteries and churches, the monks recorded the steady stream of the dying in cold ink on colder parchment. Margins were filled with pleas to heaven. Psalms were sung in empty chapels. Faith was tested. Some clung to it more tightly than ever, believing that suffering would bring them closer to God. Others despaired, doubting divine mercy in the face of so much pain. And yet, through it all, life persisted. Some children survived. Some elders endured. A loaf of bread would appear unexpectedly, gifted by a neighbor. A weak cow would birth a calf. A sudden thaw would soften the earth just enough for water to flow again. These small mercies, rare as they were, became legends in themselves. People clung to them because in the deepest heart of winter, even a single good day was something to believe in. February was not just a month, it was a crucible. Those who emerged from it bore scars that would never fade on their bodies, their hearts, and their minds. They had stared into the face of hunger, disease, and death, and had survived, or not. Either way, the memory would linger. For those still living, there was one thought above all others. Hold on, just a few more weeks, just a little longer. The sun would return, the ground would soften, the fields would call again. And when they did, the peasants would answer, not with joy, but with the grim determination born from surviving the worst that winter could offer. Because they knew, deeply and painfully, that nothing in the year compared to the horrors of February. Surviving a medieval winter was not about comfort. It was about strategy, resourcefulness, and resilience in the face of relentless hardship. Every peasant, villager, and townsman who endured the brutal months of cold, hunger, and darkness did so by drawing on a deep well of inherited knowledge. Traditions passed down from generation to generation, born not from theory, but from necessity. The tools were simple, the methods crude, but for many, they meant the difference between life and death. Clothing was the first line of defense. There were no down jackets, no waterproof boots, no synthetic fibers. Instead, people relied on natural materials, layered with care. Linen, though light and absorbent, was used as a base layer. Undergarments were made from this breathable fabric and worn close to the skin to keep sweat from freezing. Over this came thick layers of wool. Wool was prized not just for its warmth, but for its ability to retain heat, even when damp. Cloaks, tunics, and leggings were made from rough spun wool and patched year after year to preserve their usefulness. There were no zippers or buttons as we know them. Clothing was fastened with cords, belts, or wooden toggles. Toes were vulnerable, so peasants packed their shoes with straw to provide insulation. Gloves were rare, but hands were protected by wrapping them in strips of cloth or tucking them into sleeves. Hoods, hats, and scarves were considered essential. Heat lost from the head could mean frostbite or worse, and so even the youngest children wore wool caps, often handed down from siblings or neighbors. The homes themselves offered little protection on their own. Most peasant houses were built from wattle and daub, wooden frames filled in with woven branches, and a plaster of mud, straw, and dung. These walls did not hold heat well, so people adapted. They stuffed cloth or dried moss into gaps between boards. Windows, where they existed at all, were small and without glass. Instead, they were covered with oiled cloth, thin leather, or animal bladders stretched and dried until translucent. This allowed a bit of light but blocked the wind. In the worst of the storms, families simply sealed the windows with heavy cloth, sacrificing daylight for warmth. The central hearth was the soul of the house. There was no chimney. Smoke from the fire escaped through a hole in the roof or seeped through the thatch, often filling the room with a permanent haze. Eyes watered, lungs suffered, but the fire provided essential heat. Families gathered around it not just to cook, but to survive. Chairs were rare. People sat on stools, stones, or even directly on the floor, wrapping their feet and hands in layers of cloth while warming them near the flames. At night, the bed was not a private place. It was a communal space, a source of shared heat and protection. The practice of bundling, entire families sleeping in the same bed, was widespread. Parents, children, sometimes even grandparents and neighbors would huddle together under whatever blankets they had, often made from old clothes or stitched together scraps of wool. The body heat of 5 or 6 people under one cover could raise the temperature by several degrees, which in an uninsulated home could be the difference between life and frostbite. Hot food and drink were vital. Water, often contaminated in summer, became harder to access in winter as rivers and wells froze. Instead, people drank ale, weak, low-alcohol beer brewed at home or in monasteries. It was safer than water, provided some calories, and helped ward off the cold. Even children drank ale, especially in towns where clean water was scarce year-round. For food, soups and pottages became the staple. These were slow-cooked meals made from dried root vegetables, legumes, grains, and whatever meat or bones could be found. Carrots, turnips, onions, garlic, and dried beans formed the foundation of many meals. These soups simmered over the fire all day, thickening and deepening in flavor. A single cauldron might serve a family for several days, with ingredients added as needed. The goal was to keep the body warm and provide enough nourishment to stave off weakness. Bread, hard and stale by midwinter, was often softened in broth or ale. When possible, families foraged for wild herbs or dried greens collected in the autumn. In some regions, dried mushrooms or fermented vegetables were used to stretch meals further. Work did not stop entirely during the winter. People repaired tools, mended clothes, and prepared for spring. Men carved wooden handles, sharpened blades, and tended to the livestock. Women spun wool, wove cloth, and patched torn garments. Children gathered kindling or helped with indoor chores. These tasks kept hands busy and minds distracted from the ever-present cold. More importantly, they maintained the cycle of survival. each action a small investment in the future. Community played a crucial role in enduring the winter. Villages were close-knit out of necessity. People shared food, warmth, and knowledge. If a roof caved in, neighbors gathered to repair it. If a family fell ill, others brought broth or firewood. Monasteries and churches provided more than spiritual guidance. They were social lifelines. Many monasteries kept stores of food, fuel, and medicine. Though their resources were limited, monks often distributed bread or soup to the needy. The poorest and most vulnerable might find temporary shelter within a church's stone walls, where the cold was still present, but less biting than in the open air. The church was also a place of psychological refuge. In the midst of darkness and death, faith provided meaning. Services continued through the winter, offering rhythm and familiarity. Bells rang in the cold morning air, calling villagers to prayer. Candles flickered against stone walls, their light a small comfort in the long nights. Hymns echoed in the vaulted ceilings, reminding listeners that suffering had a purpose, that winter, like all trials, was part of a divine plan. Priests preached endurance, humility, and the virtues of charity. The stories of saints who had suffered worse, who had survived famines, plagues, and persecution, were told and retold. These tales gave people something to aspire to, or at least something to hold on to. Even if the body ached and the stomach growled, the soul could still believe. And that belief, fragile though it was, often made the difference. Festivals, where they could be managed, offered rare moments of light. Midwinter celebrations like Candlemas or the Feast of St. Bridget gave communities a chance to gather even briefly for warmth, singing, and the sharing of food. Though the offerings were humble, a bit of bread, a few sips of ale, the act of gathering reminded people that they were not suffering alone. Children played when they could, even in the cold. Laughter, though rare, echoed now and then across snowy fields. A game of sliding on ice, a snowball fight, a chase through the trees. These small joys broke the monotony and lifted spirits. Parents watched with cautious smiles, reminded of better days, and driven to keep those children alive until spring. Survival in a medieval winter was not passive. It was the result of active, constant effort. Every article of clothing had a purpose. Every piece of firewood was planned. Every bite of food was calculated. Families made do with little and supported one another when they could. They used every available resource, material, spiritual, communal, to outlast the ice and darkness. It was not heroism in the modern sense. It was something quieter, deeper, and older. It was the kind of endurance forged by centuries of hardship and held together by wisdom passed down in stories, habits, and traditions. The people who lived through these winters were not untouched by suffering. They were shaped by it, hardened by it. And when spring finally came, when the sun returned and the rivers ran again, they emerged into the light with the weight of memory on their backs and the simple, fierce pride of survival in their hearts. In the depths of winter, when the world was frozen, dark, and silent, belief took on a sharper edge. Medieval people did not see the cold season as merely a shift in temperature or light. Winter was a force, alive and dangerous, filled with powers both divine and demonic. It was a time when the boundary between the natural and the supernatural seemed to weaken, when the shadows grew longer and fear took root not just in the body, but in the soul. The medieval mind was deeply spiritual, but it was also deeply superstitious. Faith and fear existed side by side. Religion provided structure, but folklore filled the gaps, especially when logic failed to explain the horrors of the season. The cold was more than a weather pattern. It was a spiritual trial. The isolation, the hunger, the unrelenting dark, all of it created a breeding ground for stories, rituals, and beliefs that shaped how people understood the world and their place in it. One of the most common beliefs across Europe was that evil spirits became more powerful in the winter months. With daylight short and nights long, it was thought that demons, ghosts, and otherworldly creatures were free to roam. Fires were not just sources of heat, they were defenses against unseen forces. Crosses were carved into wooden doors and lintels. Charms were hung above beds. Salt was sprinkled around thresholds. These were not empty gestures. They were acts of spiritual protection rooted in the belief that something dangerous lurked in the dark. Churches acknowledged this fear in subtle ways. While official doctrine warned against pagan practices, it also offered its own calendar of winter rituals to provide comfort and continuity. Candlemas, observed on February 2nd, was one such ritual. It marked the presentation of Christ in the temple and the purification of the Virgin Mary. But for many villagers, it was also a symbolic end to the harshest part of winter. Candles were blessed and distributed, carried through homes and barns to chase away the lingering shadows. The flame represented Christ, yes, but also warmth, light, and survival. In the minds of the people, Candlemas was not just religious, it was magical. But not all winter traditions were Christian in origin. In fact, many of the most deeply felt rituals came from older pagan customs that had survived the Christianization of Europe by adapting to the new faith. The Yule season, celebrated in December, was one of these. Originally a Norse and Germanic midwinter festival, Yule centered around the rebirth of the sun. Bonfires were lit, feasts were held, and evergreen branches were brought into the home as symbols of life enduring through death. With the coming of Christianity, Yule merged with Christmas, but its older themes remained. The burning of the Yule log, the singing of carols, the lighting of candles, all were ways of calling back the sun, of affirming life in the face of nature's dead season. In the Alps and other mountainous regions, winter brought not just spirits, but terrifying figures who enforced moral order through fear. One such figure was Krampus, half man, half beast, with horns, hooves, and a snarling face. Krampus was said to appear in December to punish misbehaving children. He carried chains, birch rods, and a sack in which he would carry off the wicked. While St. Nicholas rewarded the good, Krampus was his dark counterpart, a reminder that winter judged everyone. The Wild Hunt was another tale that haunted the medieval imagination. This ghostly procession of riders, sometimes led by a pagan god, other times by a cursed noble or a fallen angel, was said to sweep across the sky during stormy winter nights. Those who saw it were warned to hide, for to witness the hunt was an omen of death. If the hunt passed over your home, it meant someone inside would soon perish. Some said the riders hunted souls, others that they chased the damned across the sky. Dogs howling in the distance, strange winds at night, flickers of light across the clouds, all were signs that the Wild Hunt was near. These stories were not just entertainment, they were explanations. They gave form to the terror people felt when the wind howled through the trees or when a loved one fell sick in the night. They were the psychological scaffolding that supported people through the long, dark hours of fear and helplessness. The world made more sense if there was someone to blame. The darkness itself had power. With days growing shorter and shorter, people lived most of their lives by firelight or candlelight. The human mind, deprived of sunlight, begins to suffer. Today, this is understood as seasonal affective disorder. But in the medieval world, it was interpreted through the lens of morality and religion. Darkness invited temptation. Long nights bred sin. Idle minds were believed to be vulnerable to the devil. It was no accident that confession was encouraged more during the winter, nor that sermons took on darker themes. Isolation intensified this effect. With snow-blocking roads and villages cut off from one another, many families spent weeks or months without outside contact. This bred a sense of vulnerability, not just physically, but spiritually. Without the community, without the presence of others to reinforce the shared faith, doubts crept in. Despair took root. Visions and dreams, vivid and disturbing, were common. Some believed these were visitations from saints or spirits. Others feared they were attacks by demons. In either case, the individual was left to interpret them in solitude. To fight back, people turned to ritual, blessing the home with holy water, saying the same prayer every night, lighting a candle at the same hour. These small acts created a sense of order in a world that had slipped into chaos. They were personal, intimate, and profoundly powerful. Whether or not they truly kept evil away was beside the point. They helped people feel safe. Community rituals also played a role. When possible, villagers gathered for religious feasts, not just for nourishment, but for shared belief. The ringing of bells was thought to drive away evil spirits. Singing hymns in the cold air became a form of resistance. Processions, even in the snow, united the people against a common enemy, the winter, the darkness, the unknown. Children were taught stories with moral weight, tales of greedy farmers cursed by winter, of selfish women turned to ice, of lost travelers lured off the path by glowing lights. These stories were warnings, but also lessons. They reinforced values of humility, charity, and courage. They passed on the wisdom of how to survive, not just physically, but spiritually. Do not hoard food. Help your neighbor. Keep the fire burning. Say your prayers. Superstition was not a sign of ignorance. It was a way of interpreting a world filled with suffering and unpredictability. The line between faith and fear was thin. Even the church, while condemning heresy and paganism, allowed room for local custom. Priests might turn a blind eye to the hanging of herbs or the whispering of old prayers as long as people showed up on Sunday and crossed themselves when the bell rang. And so, across the medieval world, winter became not just a season of physical struggle, but a spiritual battleground. Light against dark, good against evil, order against chaos. People did more than survive. They ritualized survival. They embedded it in their stories, their prayers, and their holidays. They surrounded themselves with symbols of hope, candles, evergreen branches, sacred icons, not because they believed these things could change the weather, but because they helped preserve the soul. As spring drew closer, the rituals continued, each one a whisper to the heavens, a plea for warmth, a gesture of endurance. The people of medieval Europe did not merely endure winter with shivering bodies. They endured it with their minds, their myths, and their memory. And it was through this inner strength, as much as through food or fire, that they made it through to the light. When the snow began to melt and the first signs of green pierced the frozen soil, hope stirred, but it was cautious, fragile, and often premature. In the medieval world, the arrival of spring did not bring instant salvation. It brought another kind of test, a slow, agonizing transition in which the suffering of winter did not end, but deepened in different ways. The most dangerous part of the year was not always the coldest. For many peasants, the weeks following winter, the early spring months, were among the most lethal of all. Malnutrition had already set in. By March, most families were living on the thinnest of rations. The root cellars were nearly empty. Salted meat, if any remained, was hard and dry. Grains were gone or spoiled. What food was left was often unfit for consumption, infested with vermin or sprouting mold. Still, it was eaten. Hunger had no room for caution. For children and the elderly especially, the damage done to the body during winter reached its climax just as the snow retreated. Immune systems, weakened by months of poor nutrition and cold, could no longer defend against disease. In these weeks, fevers spread with renewed energy. Respiratory illnesses turned fatal. Diarrhea, infections, and wasting diseases claimed the weakest, especially infants. Death did not vanish with the frost. It lingered in the thaw. This dangerous period was known even in medieval times, though not by modern medical terms. It was simply called the lean time. In later centuries, it gained a name still used in agricultural communities, the hungry gap. This was the window between the exhaustion of last year's stores and the arrival of the first new crops. In theory, spring meant planting and regrowth. In practice, it meant waiting. Waiting for seeds to sprout. Waiting for vegetables to mature. Waiting for livestock to birth their young, for trees to bud, for fields to come back to life. This waiting killed people. In years of abundance, villages might have enough to carry them through the gap. But those years were rare. More often, the previous harvest had been poor or just barely sufficient. A wet summer, a late frost, an infestation of locusts or mold could destroy crops before they were even brought in. And when that happened, there was no backup. No national food program, no emergency relief. The village had only what it had stored, and if the barns and bins were empty by March, people began to die in April. Famine years struck with terrifying force. Entire communities disappeared. Villages emptied out, sometimes slowly as people fled in search of food, and sometimes all at once as illness and starvation took hold. There are records of towns where the bells stopped ringing altogether, where no smoke rose from chimneys, where travelers found only silence. The dead were buried in mass graves, if they were buried at all. These were not rare events. Across medieval Europe, there were dozens of recorded famines between the 10th and 15th centuries, each tied to some combination of weather, war, or plague. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 was one of the most catastrophic. It began with torrential rains that drowned crops and turned roads into mud. Grain rotted in the fields. Livestock diseases spread in the damp. By the spring of 1316, the hungry gap became a chasm. People ate grass, bark, and leather. There are grim accounts of parents abandoning children, of bodies left unburied, of people digging up graves to scavenge what little remained. The psychological toll of such seasons was enormous. Winter had always been feared, but spring brought a new kind of despair, a cruel hope that was constantly delayed. A mother might plant seeds and watch her child starve before the shoots even broke the ground. A father might trade his last possession for a handful of oats that would not be edible for weeks. Faith was tested more in April than in January. How could the world be reborn while so many still died? The church tried to offer answers. Lent, the season of fasting and penance, coincided with this hungry period. Clergy preached that suffering brought the soul closer to God. Fasting was a virtue. Hunger was a spiritual test. And for many, this explanation brought comfort. Others, however, could not help but question. Why would a just God demand the lives of children as part of a seasonal ritual? Why must entire villages vanish just to preserve the cycle? Some found solace in tradition. Others turned bitter. The risk of rebellion, of banditry, and of desperation-driven violence rose sharply in famine years. Hungry men with nothing to lose became dangerous. Bands of thieves attacked travelers and raided storehouses. Local lords in fear or arrogance tightened their grip, enforcing harsher taxes or hoarding food. The social contract strained under the weight of starvation. Yet even in this bleakness, life pushed forward. Those who had managed to preserve a few seeds, a goat, or a hidden store of grain began to work the earth again. Fields were plowed by weary hands. Children, thin and pale, scattered seed in the same way their parents and grandparents had. The soil, dark and damp from the melted snow, was ready. Nature, in its own time, responded. The first sprouts emerged: barley, rye, peas, and onions. Lambs were born. Bees returned to the fields. But the relief was slow. It could take weeks or months for a crop to yield even the simplest meal. Until then, people relied on what they could find: nettles, wild garlic, early mushrooms. These were gathered with intense care. A mistake could be fatal. Some plants were toxic. Misidentifying one leaf for another could cause seizures or death. The knowledge of what could and could not be eaten was passed down with the weight of generations. Mistakes were remembered as tragedies. By early summer, if all went well, the worst was over. Bread returned to the table. Porridge thickened. Faces regained color. Laughter crept back into the villages. But the scars remained. In homes, empty chairs reminded families of those who had not survived. The fields bore the weight of loss. And even as the world turned green again, fear lingered beneath the surface, because everyone knew winter would come again. This fear shaped the behavior of those who had survived. Every sack of grain was stored with extra care. Every kernel was counted. Food was dried, salted, hidden. Wood was gathered in greater quantities. New roofs were built, stronger and thicker. Livestock were bred with greater caution. The memory of starvation was not forgotten. It lived on in habit, in ritual, in story. Children were told tales not just to entertain, but to warn. Of the winter that took their uncle, of the spring when nothing grew, of the neighbor who ate grass and never recovered. These stories, dark and real, prepared the next generation for what might come. Survival required memory, and memory was passed through storytelling, and so the cycle continued. Spring was not a clean break from suffering. It was part of the wheel. From planting to harvest, to hunger to death, and back again. The seasons turned, but the struggle remained. Each year offered a chance, not a guarantee, to live through it. And each year demanded the same thing in return: preparation, sacrifice, endurance. Medieval people did not romanticize spring. They respected it, feared it, and worked with it. They understood the land not as a gift, but as a partner, one that could bless or betray. And in that partnership, they placed everything, their hope, their labor, their lives. The cycle did not pause for grief. It moved forward, slow and unrelenting, and those who survived did so not with celebration, but with quiet resolve. They had made it through another winter, but the next one was already coming. Could you survive 1 week in a medieval winter? What's the one thing you'd bring back in time to help? Let me know in the comments. And share this video with someone who thinks winter is just cozy blankets and hot cocoa.